Hi, team.
Hello.
Hi, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here. My name is Shannon Brennan. I'm a professor of English as well as Women and Gender Studies, and we're here with the Visiting Writers series. The first, this is the first of a number of really cool programs that we have coming. Actually, I should have done my homework ahead of time and to tell you dates of things.
Well, we should just mention the one on Tuesday, because it's coming up so quickly.
Yes, do.
Tuesday, February 14th, Adam Ross will be reading from his new novel in the same room, 6 p.m. So come back next Tuesday.
Yeah, so Valentine's Day, which is what Tuesday is if you believe in that kind of thing, that's 6 o'clock on that day, the 14th, in this room, Adam Ross reading from his novel. And I'm much more excited about the present because we're in it right now, but I'm also excited about Tuesday, and I'm happy to introduce to you Cristina Rodriguez, a professor of English at Providence College. She's also the director of the American Studies program there, and the author of this really cool book, Walk the Barrio, from University of Virginia Press, which combines sociology and autobiography and literary studies and critical theory to think about place and race and identity and ethnicity and culture and how these things combine, and thinking about what it means to be places and write about those places. I don't want to give too much away. I imagine I couldn't. I'm not capable of it, but this is much less interesting than what's about to happen. So I won't say anything more except for to invite you to welcome, please, Cristina Rodriguez.
Hello. Can you hear me without this?
Well, it's the same either way, I think. It's not picking up.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to the Visiting Writer Series. Thank you to the English Department. Thank you to Shannon Brennan and for David Garcia as well, who took me under his wing today. I also encourage you, if you haven't gotten a taco or hit up that elote bar, please feel free to do that while we're talking. I'd love to have as convivial an atmosphere as possible. And yes, that was such a lovely introduction. It seems like my book is doing a lot of things, and I hope not to disappoint. I do want to say briefly before I get into it that this talk isn't going to talk as much about all of the incredible poets and novelists and memoirists that I write about in the book, but if you are interested in learning more about contemporary transnational Latinx lit at all, please come talk. If you're like, I love giving out recs, and I will be mentioning several authors, but if you are like, oh, I'm looking for a book about whatever it is, like it's my love. So, and then just come talk to me in general. So, we're going to talk about space today, and hopefully give you a few tools for thinking through the spaces you inhabit, how they work, and how they work on you. And I am hoping this is going to be somewhat collaborative. I have a lot of questions sort of built in, and I hope we can share a little bit about the spaces that we're from, learn from each other. And then to close with, I will show you how this way of thinking can apply to literature with the poem that is also near and dear to my heart. So to start, I'm going to read just a little bit from the beginning of the book so you understand where this focus on space comes from. And then I'm going to walk you through some key relationships between space, immigration, and identity that I found in my research. And kind of, as we go, we'll kind of add on tools that we can use to close read space in general, and then to close read text if we feel like it. So let me begin. The introduction says, my hometown, Silver Spring, and the method of Walk the Barrio. In the neighborhood I grew up in, everybody seemed to be from somewhere else. In the 1980s and 1990s, our corner of metropolitan Silver Spring, Maryland, zip code 20901, was increasingly Salvadoran, as well as Ethiopian, Haitian, and Jamaican. The local dollar theater turned into a Spanish Pentecostal church when I was a kid, and the main drag of my neighborhood, Flower Avenue, increasingly boasted predominantly Latin American stores and restaurants. El Gavilan, up the street by the giant supermarket, was a neighborhood Salvadoran hotspot. I remember being accosted by the boisterous music and circulating sizzling skillets of fajitas as a preteen, and then proudly bringing friends back to this authentic hole-in-the-wall dining experience as an adult. Around the corner, you could get pupusas from the food truck outside the Giants parking lot, or fresh cuts of meat and jewelry from the Pan American Market in the mini strip mall. A little further down towards the Silver Spring Metro stop, African fashion shops, Ethiopian restaurants, and the varied commerce of 16th Street and Georgia Avenue rub shoulders with the quirky down-and-out legacies of a bygone era. The Tasty Diner, the old Silver Spring Theater, the Woodside Deli, Old Blair High School, the takeout seafood joints. The neighborhood at that time was somewhat divided. Our section of Flower Avenue was mostly single-family homes, with a lot of neighbors whose parents were from Indiana or Virginia, who I'm sure could trace their time in this country at least a few generations back. Yet just up the hill, Silver Spring turned into what my mom liked to call Cowboylandia, a full-blown colonia of Salvadoran life. I see echoes of my hometown in every barrio I visit. My best friends in grade school had parents from the Philippines, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Ghana, and Ireland. Non-immigrant families felt like the minority. So I never had to explain my mother's accent or the harrowing, scarring experience of Saturday Argentine school, which I will tell you stories later if you are interested, or my occasional strangely pronounced word. I would go to my friends' houses and hear their parents and relatives speaking in Tagalog, or look over what goods a family friend had brought them from Ethiopia, and the awkwardness my friends felt walking through the scene, dodging questions in that other language, matched my own when I was a host. As I grew up, the schools and neighborhoods I was a part of became more and more monochromatic. But I largely embraced my own personal blanqueamiento, or whitening, since I never really felt Latina enough to claim it as an identity anyway. Only my mom was a Latin American immigrant. While my dad's surname and his father are both Puerto Rican, my father is more from Long Island than anywhere else. It is actually a country of its own, look it up. Speaking Spanish in public was a hardship of bruised pride. I looked white. I was white. Better to not self-identify. Somebody might call me out, say I didn't speak Spanish well enough, or worse, that my Spanish was learned, not innate, or that I didn't look Latina enough, or that I wasn't really ethnic enough. I'm not sure who I thought was policing the border of identity claims, but I feared them for exposing me as a fraud. It was only much, much later that I realized that my particular experience of identity anxiety might be shared. I had never read any Latinx literature before graduate school. And as I plodded my way through coursework and talked out ideas with my mentors, the issue of identity kept cropping up for me. It crystallized during my master's exam. And it's funny, David, we had been talking in your class about these sort of kind of aha moments you have in an English class where you realize that you can do something you didn't know that you could do. I had written about how Gail Jones experiments with form in her novel Mosquito to create for the reader a lived experience of a Black female narrator who can only find belonging in the Southwest borderlands. And as I defended my thesis, the chair, either assuming from my surname or deducing from my analysis, asked me, how does your research relate to your own experiences of identity? And it had literally never occurred to me prior to that moment that there was any connection between what I was studying and who I was. Yet as I answered the panel, stumbling over my interest in narratives about belonging, I realized that I was drawn to stories like my own. Stories that wonder, what does it mean to feel between identities? How does it happen? And what does it look like? Indeed, I knew from childhood that there were whole neighborhoods of kids like me who weren't quite of the place their parents were from and weren't quite fully of here either. I saw it in my UC Irvine students too, whose parents were from Mexico, Vietnam, the Philippines, Japan, that these questions of where and how to belong were relevant. Surely, I thought, in this era of globalization and widespread immigration, I was not alone in feeling this way. Surely writers were talking about this, and as the world was only getting smaller and more interconnected, surely we all needed to be talking about this. I started to believe that this experience of identity was underrepresented in academic scholarship. I wanted to study and promote the literature that spoke to this way of being in the world. In that body of work, what I found was that in the face of uncertainty over who they were, authors tightened their grip on where they were. They claimed their neighborhoods all the more fiercely because of the ambivalence with which they claimed other aspects of themselves, like their dominant language, ethnicity, nationality, and class, and more. An anxiety over being authentic enough, meaning Latinx enough, or working class enough, or for some middle class enough, Spanish speaking enough, expressed itself in the form of the writing. As someone whose sense of self still gains strength from where I grew up, who still references that locally shared immigrant identity I felt as a kid to try and cobble together a sense of genuine letting down for myself, to keep that identity border patrol at bay. This discovery rang true. That's kind of how the book comes about. And I'll just read a little bit from the introductory claims. Walk the Barrio starts from an almost obvious premise. Immigrants and their communities have a particular and intensified relationship to place. Authors from transnational social fields evince in their work a sharpened perception of and connection to their local spaces, which we can see in their writing from, of, and about their neighborhoods. When I tell non-academics this, most nod their heads vigorously, asserting, of course that's true. Scholars agree. We are not only aware of the link, but also know which questions to ask as a consequence. If immigrants have a distinct connection to place, how does that manifest? What forms does that connection take? Yet, although most of us accept that initial point about immigrants and place identity, and some of us ask the right questions, very few have followed where those questions should lead. That's because as academics, we tend to look down at the page for answers. It's ironic, I'm looking at it right now, rather than looking around. To write about place, you have to experience place. This is the second not so obvious premise of the book. By experience here, I don't mean just plumbing the local archives or reading about the town's history. I mean walking the streets, talking to people, often the authors themselves when they let me, and placing oneself physically in the spaces that one is attempting to understand. You cannot experience place remotely. There are a lot of theorists who masterfully expound upon this idea, and we'll talk about some. But I hardly need them to defend the underlying postulate, since this is another concept that makes sense to most people as soon as you say it. We know that you experience place in your body, right? We know that spaces are unique and they feel unique. Yet as scholars, we rarely employ that knowledge or behave in accordance with that knowledge when we are thinking about place identity and authorship. So the effect of these two premises is quite simple. In a book about immigrants writing in places, I talk to immigrants, interview authors, and go to places. Goodbye. Come back. Oh. Get it away. I visit the immigrant community being written about, follow in the steps of the author or protagonist, and tease out the connections between the character of the place and the form of the literary work. So each author in Walk the Barrio writes about his or her own U.S. barrio, either in fiction, poetry, or memoir. And each chapter of the book goes to a different barrio, a neighborhood, using the text as a kind of map and performing what I call a barriography. That's a combination of first-person reportage, like I did kind of at the beginning, where I'm in the field visiting the neighborhood, along with urban geography, critical theory, and of course the literary analysis of the work that brought me there in the first place. The barriography reveals how the character of the place informs the literary experimentations of the work. Okay? So, how can we learn to think about space? I want to introduce you to 5 theoretical lenses that I find helpful, and see if you can apply them to your own hometown, or sometimes even this campus, if you feel like it. Then we'll try out reading a poem with this spatial awareness in mind. Sound good? Okay. We start hard, then it gets easier. Henri Lefebvre, and I am murdering that pronunciation. I apologize to the francophiles of the room. Lefebvre is a famous French Marxist philosopher. Being a Marxist means that he feels that economic forces influence all other forces, right? Culture, politics, everything else is directly impacted by the economy. In this work, The Production of Space, he makes the claim that social space is a social product. And social is in parentheses there. So really he's saying space is a product. What he means by that is that space is not neutral. It is made. There is never empty space that humans then fill. Our relationship to space is always social. We are always transforming space by just being in it. Lefebvre focuses on who makes space and why. So for him, each form of economy produces its own kind of space. So as an example, in a capitalist economy dominated by manufacture, You've got the factory or the warehouse, right, which is owned by a capitalist, keep it simple, who must ensure that workers are able to work and who wants to maximize labor. So 19th century mill towns or factory towns are organized spatially around that site of production. Workers live within walking distance and arrange themselves according to their work schedule, right? Childcare, education, and neighborhood ties are all related to labor. Public transportation serves, and the road networks are going to be linked to those centers of economic production. They are serving that economic production. Housing will also be linked to those networks, right? So everything comes apart from that. What we've seen in the US at the end of the 20th century, as a result of what is known as post-industrial capitalism, is what happens when these centers of economic production, these sources of skilled and unskilled labor jobs, close down and move overseas so that they can exploit a different labor force, right? And then all of that infrastructure that was there becomes sort of hollowed out. So you have, in many cases, in many cities in the United States, housing networks, public transportation, et cetera, that were all built around a center of production that is now gone, leaving in its wake all the issues that that entails when there's no longer an economic engine manning that infrastructure. So I find that very helpful. Lefebvre has one other cool idea about space. Well, he has a couple, but I like this other idea about thinking about space, which is that it's stratified. And so there are 3 levels of space we can think about. The highest up is perceived space. This is the space secreted by a society. Did you know there's a society where we're secreting space? Now you do. I hope it feels creepy. So the way space is set up according to what production protects the economy. The next 2 levels are a little bit more interesting. So the next level down is conceived space. This is the space of urban planners, of scientists, of map makers. This is the space that is expressed in words and images and symbols. So it reinforces perceived space, that big space up top, by codifying it. It literally puts down on paper an interpretation of space. And it's going to be in the service of that economic mode of production. So an example of conceived space, I guess I should have kind of changed this for the audience, is a subway map. I don't know how many of you are familiar with subway maps, but it's a very interesting schematic that you really can't use once you're above ground. On the ground level, at the base is lived space. This is how space is experienced by the users or inhabitants of space. If it is expressed, it's expressed symbolically through art. How I experience my neighborhood is not going to match up with either a Google map of my neighborhood or a census poll of my neighborhood or the systems of transit and flows of labor of my neighborhood, right? So an example of lived space, I think, would be a community mural, right? An artistic production that is buy-in from those who live in that space. So I use Lefebvre to think about the tension between inhabitants and users of a space, those who have that knowledge based on lived experience, and urban planners or politicians who operate in conceived space, who think they have knowledge but they actually just have information. So for example, the unhoused and undocumented in Hector Tobar's The Tattooed Soldier are not on any map. And the media forgets them when it tells the story of the Rodney King riots, which is the setting for that novel. But it is the eruption of their frustrations that culminates in the righteous destruction of downtown LA that happens in that novel. They transform the space around them. Your turn. Some questions based on Lefebvre. What is the economy of your hometown? How do the people in your hometown make money? Is there one? Do they go elsewhere to make their dollars? What are the newest elements of your town? That can be a really helpful way to figure out what the industry is what's the newest thing? Did there used to be an industry that has since gone away? Is your town linked to the surroundings with public transit or with highways? Who works in your town? Do they live there? If not, how do they get there? That's the first question. Take a minute. You can answer any one of these questions. Yes, Claire?
I'm from Baraboo, Wisconsin, which is right near Devil's Lake. So the primary economy is tourism. So a lot of like bed and breakfasts, like cute downtown shops there, and then we also have a museum called the Circus World Museum. It's the biggest circus museum in the country, so tourism for that as well.
Interesting. So the Circus Museum, that's year-round.
Yes.
But the other tourism industry is seasonal, yeah?
Yep.
So what happens to those who work in the tourism industry in the off-season?
I don't really know.
Yeah, yeah. Do you have a sort of an influx of workers that come for the season?
Yeah, so that applies to us as well as the Wisconsin Dells, which are nearby. And so what will happen is there are students called J1 students who come from other countries to work in the U.S. just during the summer, and then they return to their countries
Yeah.
after the summer is over.
Yeah. Do you have any idea where those J1
Mhm.
residents live?
Yeah, the biggest employers have like hostel style housing for them.
Interesting. 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 So you've got this sort of tourism, and I wonder if there was an industry before. Thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah.
I wonder if there was an industry before then, before your town sort of converted to tourism. I imagine there was. I imagine it wasn't always just like, oh, this is this paradisal place we're going to stay, because I bet it gets kind of cold in the winter. And then things kind of spring up to support that, right? Okay, we need workers. Okay, we need to house our workers. They're not going to be part of the regular housing population, so we're going to put them up in hostels, right? Because they're seasonal. And probably there's also some interesting tensions between those who live in the town year-round and those who come to the town to work. There may not be a lot of integration, like those hostels may not be sort of in the center of town. In fact, they're going to be closer to the tourist centers, right? Which are, again, seasonal. So great example of how the economy is sort of operates at all these other levels, right? Any other examples? Yes, what's your name?
I'm from Gary, Indiana, and I mean, that's the steel city, historically the steel city of the United States. Everything that you talked about I'm not sure how you pronounce his last name, but all
No one, well, maybe Caitlin can say it. Can Caitlin say it for us every time?
The Fed.
The Fed.
Thank you. But all of it applies to Northwest Indiana. There's not only inland steel, but there used to be a bunch of steel mills. Since the 80s, those jobs have sort of, floated away or disappeared, or however you want to put it.
Yeah.
And Gary, Indiana to say it's debilitated is an understatement.
Right. Because there isn't the service sector kind of rushes in to replace these jobs, but it's not the same, right? I mean, those skilled and unskilled labor sources.
In the heart of Gary, I really don't know that there is a demand for service, like hotel or. Yeah. I'm sure that they try.
Right. Yeah, but there's this loss, right? And so you have kind of these roads, like all of the transit, all the things in the city is organized around a mode of production that is now defunct, is now on its way out. Yeah. Yeah, one more?
I feel like we have to talk about Kenosha.
You
want to talk about Kenosha?
You've been here longer. But I think also.
This is also.
Well, tell me what you know, and then I can, go around the
Well,
edges.
I used to live over on 24th Avenue, which was like an alleyway away from the old Chrysler company. If people from here know about that, yeah. So I wasn't here while it was running.
Yeah.
But after it was shut down, it's just this huge lot of emptiness, and our house actually ended up being foreclosed because they wanted to redo that entire neighborhood. So we ended up moving because of that reason as well. And it's still an empty lot because I think they're waiting for the grounds to no longer be toxic.
Oh.
Yeah.
I think that they have projects that they're planning. At the University of Wisconsin Parkside, there are conversations about it. And so something's going on. But even before that factory, there was AMC. They have, this area has, to say that it has a local car show is an understatement.
I've worked it before.
When I was new here, I used to rent a place by the lake, and there would be weekends where thousands of cars would be parked from the lake up to the Sheridan, maybe. and you couldn't get in your own, I mean, it was, and so I learned that there were these car shows.
Yeah.
And they're very popular.
I wonder if the car shows came out of, so there used to be a Chrysler factory?
Is it
So there was,
AMC?
I'm sorry?
AMC
Yeah.
factory.
This
Yeah,
was one of
AMC.
the
Like
earliest
Gremlin.
production centers of automobiles in the country.
Okay.
And
That
the
was good.
birth of the labor movement is
Yes,
here.
okay, yeah.
United Auto Workers was born here.
Mhm.
Right before there were cars, there were mattresses. Simmons
Yeah.
mattresses were.
But the mattress shows were a lot less popular.
But we had Nash and then Chrysler
Yeah.
purchased it only to turn around and sell it almost immediately. And then the city collapsed in the late 80s.
Yep.
But the city was able to get, the mayor was able to get really a lot of federal funds to clean up the whole area. And people were worried that, what will we do with the displaced workers? Well, some of them went to other factories, but many of them start new businesses. So Kenosha really hasn't, it didn't really suffer as much as they thought it would.
It bounced back.
It bounced back.
It bounced back.
Yeah.
That's,
It did.
If you want to see it in action,
That's
I
heartening.
have a picture
Of
of
the
the
car show.
this year.
so I was going to say it's very interesting, and we'll talk about this a little bit later with sort of power of place, but that the car show, which was linked to this industry that's now gone, the car show remains. And so you're
Even
like,
after
oh,
COVID too, this is the
Yeah.
first
I
time.
doubt
Wow.
there's another
Wow.
town in the country that is more interesting to talk about these questions with
Yeah.
than Kenosha, Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Well, and then there's Tools and Jockey, those are big ones.
yeah, yeah.
So like,
Well, no, so the newest elements of the town, I live on the northwest side of the Kenosha Racine area, and I live right by, when I moved, I was like, what is that glass? One thing I'm moving right by, it's Foxconn's new giant
Right.
plant,
yeah.
which is, like, what is it, like, they're the big screens or something, process?
They
Like,
change every year.
They should really decide on something.
Stillwater Air project, Dog open the site.
Right. So an attempt to try and bring back what is kind of it's an older way of organizing, it's an older way of building and manufacture. And so a lot of, it sounds like redevelopment projects that I assume are going to attempt to, maybe if you're lucky, sort of redevelop and revitalize downtown, or if you're not, are going to put that money into highway transportation and ways to sort of like get past downtown to suburbs perhaps. So yeah, it's really interesting all the ways in which a town tries to sort of reimagine itself with the pieces that are built in a very particular way. Maybe we will continue to talk about Kenosha as we go. Next theory, transnationalism, near and dear to my heart. So transnationalism is the assertion that immigrants forge and sustain multi-stranded social relationships that link together their societies of origin and settlement. Basically, that many immigrants span borders, economically, politically, and culturally. So my book looks at contemporary immigration, first and second generation, and in every neighborhood I visit for this research, I see transnationalism at work. So one way I think about it is that if, Caitlin, Lefebvre, say it again?
You got it.
Lefebvre.
Yeah.
If Lefebvre says that a society secretes a society's space, and if we each have intense lived experiences of a particular place or space, it makes sense that we would carry our understanding of space with us from a different country of origin, right? Thus, MacArthur Park in LA, which I talk about in the book, which is the heart, or one of the hearts of the Central American diaspora, demonstrates a Central American spatial logic. The sidewalk becomes an open-air market with vendors laying out their goods. The storefronts blast their music out open doors, and the park becomes the gathering point, the sort of focal point of the neighborhood, trying to recreate that idea of sort of like a plaza, right? With groups of men that are, talking about how to take over the universe, and young lovers trying to get away from their parents and really strict curfews. Transnationalism often entails the splitting up of nuclear families to secure work in the US and to maximize financial gains, right? In metropolitan New York, also in the book, this has resulted in a disparate number of female-led Dominican households in particular. The Dominican Republic is often held up as the sort of like the example of transnationalism. I think it's one of the DR's like chief gross domestic products is actually remittances, which is money coming from abroad. In the Dominican American barrios that Junot Diaz and Andrew Cruz described, the shifting gender norms produced by women earning income and achieving more independence than on the island has profound effects upon gender roles in traditional Dominican communities, which has in turn transformed neighborhood cultural practices. In most of the text in the book, I also see transnationalism operating in terms of identity anxiety. Several authors in the book are second generation who feel that they aren't enough from the country their parents are from and aren't really from the US either. The various ways they perform an ethnic identity to establish themselves often takes the form of demonstrating expertise about their barrio, as I mentioned at the top, right? They can't fully claim the DR or El Salvador or Cuba or Mexico, but they can claim Washington Heights, El Monte, Little Havana. So think about the identities that you possess or perform, depending on how post-structuralist you might be about it. Have you ever felt that you were not enough of something? Or like you weren't a real whatever it was? And where do you think that anxiety comes from? So that's a question I want you to think about, and then this is a more general question from this, thinking about transnationalism. Are you from an immigrant neighborhood? If so, how do you see evidence of the spatial organization of a different country at work in your town? Put another way, in what ways have the immigrants made that town like wherever they came from? How do the norms of your family intersect with the norms of your hometown spaces? Are they different? Yes, what's your name?
My name's Hannah.
Hi, Hannah.
So I come from a neighborhood which was built by white people, but then now it is most predominantly full of Latinx people and a lot of undocumented immigrants. When I went to school, I was one of maybe 10 people who were Caucasian in the whole school. And so I feel like a lot of the buildings and structure are the exact same. However, I feel like they have made spaces for themselves. Like we have a Swaparama, and that is almost all people of color who go there. And if you go there, they have vendors who will sell like elote, and they'll have a lot of great things, and they'll sell things for each of the different countries that they're representing there. So it's really been awesome to grow up in that area because I was able to learn so much about different cultures that were different from mine because I didn't fit in with it, but I learned so much and it made me like see things different ways from a young age.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Different cultural norms from your household,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I like your point about how the buildings, so the infrastructure kind of remained the same, right? It was more sort of trying to make do with the space and move it in ways that could make it feel more like home, right? And sort of on the smaller scale. Thank you so much. Yeah, Anjali.
So when I grew up, I think just looking at like Madison, Wisconsin, thinks of itself as a very progressive multicultural place, university town. But there's a lot of segregation within Madison. And growing up, like my mom's from India, and we live in, or like the neighborhood I grew up in is predominantly white. But there is a large medical software company called Epic that has a lot of immigrants from India actually that work there, and they all live in sort of one part of town, which is kind of adjacent to the neighborhood I grew up in.
Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting because like there's our neighbors are like, or we have a white neighbors who would go running with my mom every morning, and you know my mom's from India, but because we'd grown up in this area, I think she just like forgot where she was from. But anyway, so they were running together and they run past this complex where there's a lot of Indian immigrants. And our neighbor was like telling my mom like, oh, you know, these people, they come, you know, they're like, they don't integrate, they don't, you know, and just kind of like talking about like how it's like, I don't know, like terrible it is that that there's all these new people coming in and taking up these, you know, spaces. And my mom's jogging next to her and being like, Joan, where do you think I came from? You know, like, as they're on this run. And so I think that even in spaces that are diverse, the diversity can be very segregated, and the narrative that sometimes, that there's different narratives within the same town and space of what that diversity means, I think, to different residents. And because I think in our school system, we were very much taught like, oh, this is Madison, we're progressive, we're liberal, we're excited about the diversity in this space. But if you look at the, like in my high school, the achievement gap between students of color and white students and
not so
Asian
progressive
students was quite large. And if you think about tracking and all these other ways in which the segregation is appearing within the city of Madison, and when I was a social worker later, and going to all these spaces that I hadn't been to all these different libraries, just looking at the library in Middleton, which is a suburb of Madison, versus the library on Raymond Road, you know, and how people are using that space. And I think if you just look at how communities are using the library spaces or public spaces that are built for public consumption, you know, in Middleton it was a giant library built to look like Frank Lloyd Wright, right, with these like stained glass windows, and everyone was quiet, and there's only like 3 people in that giant library. Right. Whereas there's this tiny packed space on Raymond Road where there's all these families and all these like kids running around and screaming, and some parents just like left their kids there and left, and like, you know, the librarians are like running around hectic, but there's like a lot of life and vibrancy and like, you know, and actually community space and building in that and programming in that space. And even though it was, you know, a tenth of the size of that other library. You know? And so I just think it's interesting how these different spaces.
Different use of public space. Yes. Which we're going to get into. Yeah, different use of public space. You just reminded me, I had forgotten this until you said that, you know, where I grew up, there was like a little parkway that ran by a creek. And it was, you know, park space. And on the weekends, it was all the Central American, like, it was like the barbecue, there were like barbecue pits that were being used. There were hammocks that were being put up like for the day. It was just like this like beautiful, colorful like setup of like taking this space that was technically public, but like the, you know, white people in the area just weren't thinking of it in using it in that kind of a way. And I mean, the flip side of segregation is you also want to, if you're trying to, you know, recreate the things you love about your country of origin, you also are wanting to, you know, you're wanting to stay in your language, you're wanting to stay in those practices. And so the idea of like, oh, why don't they integrate is really saying, why don't they assimilate? Gonna move, yeah.
I was just gonna say that I'm from Hills Corners, which is a suburb of Milwaukee, and so obviously Milwaukee's like one of the most segregated cities in the United States. And so there's definitely different areas where, you know, you go into an area and it is all the same restaurants, shops, you know, Latinx or African American, or, you know, even stuff like Polish or Irish areas, and how drastic those borders can be, like just like a street, you know, you move from one street to another.
Yeah. I'm so glad about that because I forgot to mention also, right, in a lot of cases, we're also talking about redlining. We're also talking about practices supported by the government, sanctioned by the government, that limited where people could live. So, you know, where that segregation comes from is it's a very, very interesting thing for sure. This definitely brings us into Mike Davis. Mike Davis is an urban historian, and he argues that 20th century cities often explicitly use spaces to exclude and police working class communities and communities of color. Speaking of Los Angeles, which he likes to do, he claims that there is a new class war at the level of the built environment. So Davis describes all the ways that a city creates spaces that are supposedly public, but that are only meant for some residents. He calls them soft environments. So here are some examples. Parks that look public, but are actually policed and gated by the surrounding residents, right? To prevent visitors from other neighborhoods without public spaces of their own. His best example, and the one that once I tell it to you, if you don't already know it, you are never going to look at a park bench the same again. I guarantee you.
And that is all of the methods used to contain the unhoused, including bum-proof benches, right? So benches that have ways that prevent someone from being able to lay down on them. Deploying sprinkler systems at all hours of the night to deter encampments. A lack of restrooms or public facilities in public spaces. And the policing of public areas, both with the LAPD and with security cameras, right? All these ways in which we try and manage space while saying, no, it's public, right? These sort of pseudo-public spaces. And I have an example here of a mall, but I think that you get the idea. For Davis, Lefebvre's, conceived space, the space of the map makers and the urban planners and the developers is directly at odds with the city's lived space. Los Angeles' housing, transportation, and leisure is set up to maintain a ready workforce close by while keeping that workforce segregated and excluded from upper-class white neighborhoods. The old centers of the city of Los Angeles, supported by a different economy of unskilled and skilled manufacture, become at best sites of tourism and recreation, fed by developers, or at worst, completely abandoned. And highways in LA and many other cities now run directly through and over many former communities, rather than invest in their development. It's like, well, we're not gonna put money in this, we're just gonna move on. In the book, I apply Mike Davis to Elena Maria Viramontes' novel, Their Dogs Came With Them. Viramontes describes a 10-year span from the massive construction of several highways that tore up the historically Mexican and long-standing immigrant communities of the east side of LA, to the deep consequences to the barrio of that encroachment. So basically, she talks about the construction of these 6 highways that crisscross the east side of LA, how they're built, and then the impact of that even 10 years later. The city planners saw the east side as an obstacle to motorists trying to get from the downtown core to the far out suburbs. And their plans hollowed out public transportation and public transit and isolated that barrio. Viramontes' residents perceived LA's urban planning as basically an act of war, which in many ways it was, and that's how they experienced it. I made this one about the campus. Hope that's okay. I think Mike Davis is really helpful to think about campus spaces. How is Carthage's space set up? What is its relationship to the world outside the campus? How might we know this? Are there gates, security? What is the college's rhetoric around safety? Where are the public spaces? Who uses them? How is the cafeteria set up? Who is it built for? I forgot to pay attention when we drove in this morning about the security situation. But where I work at Providence College, there are very high gates, and there is a very imposing, what do you call the place where like a security guard, like a hut, a toll booth? A what? Yeah. There's like a little hut where the security guard has windows where he can, it's always a man, where he can make sure that you are in fact who they want to come in, right? Maybe Carthage doesn't have that kind of setup, but is there a rhetoric around security?
Yes.
Yes?
Can we like just little huts? We only have 2 of those, and they're only in the off-campus parking lots. But there's never anyone in them.
Okay, there's empty huts. Empty huts.
Empty huts.
Empty huts. Okay.
But they
So
talk
there's,
a lot about like the police coming on campus and all the security officers, and they have the notification system for any time there's anything shady, and it's like, yeah, it's very, there's a rhetoric around it.
yeah.
Wouldn't even, no.
You what?
I think the best way that we describe our own campus safety is that they're glorified police officers, so that we don't have to have Kenosha police come on campus.
Right.
Mainly for insurance.
Because your parents would not like that.
That's the
Yeah,
reality.
no,
I'm
it's
saying that's what they want us to be.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Apparently there was a shooting close by at a salon the other day, and I didn't know about it until someone talked about it. And I was
Right.
like, oh, that's great.
Yeah.
So if I want to know if I'm safe or not, I have to check Yik Yak and not my email from campus safety.
Right.
That's wonderful.
Well, because they've
Yeah.
spent their time, or they're spending their energy on trying to isolate Carthage from the surroundings, so that
Exactly.
if you don't hear about it, they've done their job to some extent, right? They want to create as much as possible this idea that you are a separate alcove
without actually outright saying it. They were like, no, you're a part of the community, but except like you're right by the lake on one side and then there's this giant highway on the other, so, yeah.
I was going to comment on that because I'm an alum. So I went to Carthage, I graduated 2 years ago. And now I live in Kenosha, I'm a teacher here. And so there is a really stark difference on how Carthage does use its security and how people experience security here. There's a false sense of safety where everyone's like, well, we have security guards and like we have locks on our doors. But then while I've been here, there's been some very unfortunate things when I attended Carthage that happened, which really made me feel unsafe. And going into the community, that was the true aspect as soon as I became a teacher. I'm not going to touch on some of the things that are happening in our schools because that's not what we're talking about right now. But the way that our communities are being kept safe is very interesting, and it's not very representative of how the campus is. So if you come from Carthage and you move into Kenosha, never having experienced the community and what they're experiencing, you're in for a big culture shock because it is completely different.
Yeah.
The only thing that is the same is that they are the most friendly people in the world, the actual citizens, not the people enforcing the laws.
Right. Right. Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah. The college space is a very rarefied space in a lot of ways. I'm going to move on because I am scared that we'll run out of time. But just to her point about feeling unsafe, I think it's also, I'm not quite sure where to put this into this talk, but it's also when gender can come into play, right? How we experience spaces differently based on our bodies. Raul Maravilla, Barrio Logos, so good. Go read it. He's a Chicanx cultural studies theorist, and he says that a barrio emerges from two opposing forces. Barrioization, so that's like the dominating external social processes that come from outside the barrio and work upon it, including legal and physical and ideological control of the space and its residents. And barriology, so this is the forces, the internal forces, the forces a community builds in response to that external pressure. And these are largely positive practices like transforming space into place through community action or organized political movement. But unfortunately, there are also some negative forces as a result of that pressure, such as crime or poverty. And these powers are in a dialectic, they influence each other, they're always moving off of each other. In the book, I use Villa many times, but in particular, to understand Angie Cruz's Washington Heights neighborhood in her debut novel, Soledad. Oh, and this is talking about gender spaces, great. It's all come together. This working class Dominican neighborhood was ravaged by crack cocaine in the 1980s, and it found itself forgotten politically, right? Because you had a lot of new Dominican immigrants who weren't involved in the political process, who weren't included. So it turned inward with community watches and informal policing to gain back its streets, to gain back its public spaces, and it was successful. But that positive cultural response to neglect turned negative in the 1990s when that policing becomes surveillance, especially the surveillance of women. Cruz describes the impact of this crushing surveillance on Dominican and Dominican American women in the novel who are threatened by the male gaze throughout the neighborhood. So it's kind of like that neighborhood watch turns dark in the book. How does your gender impact your experience of your hometown? Does it? Do you feel comfortable walking your streets alone? Is your town connected to a larger urban center? Or do other towns connect to your city? What is the relationship between these spaces? In what ways has your neighborhood responded to its reputation from the outside? I just learned an example today from Dr. Mitchell. I believe we were talking about Kenosha, or we were talking about Racine. Apparently, so there's a couple barrios in Racine, and the sheriff in town got it into a mind that he wanted to really crack down on those barrios. And so he began setting up shops, setting up cops, local police enforcement, sheriffs and deputies at the entrances of the barrio at 6 a.m. in the morning, trying to catch people who were leaving to go to work, right?
Well, undocumented people.
Well,
going to work.
that's what comes out of it, right? Yeah. So to pull someone over for whatever reason you can come up with, whatever bullshit traffic stop you can find, and then being able to attempt to deport, to fine, to otherwise curb and police. That's an example of barrioization, right? This external force that's placed on the barrio. This idea, literally policing, literally curbing the movement of residents. And in response, I think a great example of barriology, that community said, no, we're gonna organize, we're gonna fight back, and produced maps for white
We
for
produced the maps, we just showed up, community organization.
Yeah.
Our community organization showed up in the 3 barrios where this was happening and just marched around with signs that said stop. They're big red stop signs that said stop.
yeah.
And you know, the flip side was doing the little data analysis on the kind of stops that they were doing
Yeah,
and embarrassing them.
good. And getting media attention
Yeah.
and drawing attention to it. And it stopped and it worked.
And it worked.
And it worked.
And it worked. It stopped.
So a great
Stop.
example of this. Stop. We gotta move on. Leave you with these questions. Number 5, Dolores Hayden, Power of Place. Hayden implies that there is a prejudice against preserving the social history of groups often excluded from official history, so women, minorities, and the working class. She notices that we tend to think of architectural value in terms of beauty, which often means we are thinking in terms of wealth, how much something costs to build. This leads us to focus on preserving opulent residences and grand architectural structures, and to allow more impoverished structures, tenements, working class homes, old factories, to be erased and developed upon. By protecting and preserving based on beauty and economic investment, we in essence protect and preserve only a fraction of that space's local history. So at stake is not just history, but also inclusion for residents, right? And inclusion for all those who are not part of the narrative of wealth and power symbolized in our city's landmarks. Stories of women's work in history, the work of immigrants, people of color, stories of LGBTQ plus communities. And the extra stake is that spaces have place memory. That's her term for the stabilizing persistence of place as a container for experiences that contributes powerfully to its intrinsic memorability. So put more simply, a space can trigger a social memory, since our memories are naturally place-oriented. A space can act as a storehouse for a community's memories. It stabilizes the experiences that occurred within it that allow us to remember it when we, and to allow us to kind of access that space. Access those memories as we access that space. So an abandoned factory maintains the memory of generations of workers who labored there. A tenement keeps the imprint of all the families who lived there. And for the neighborhood around those spaces, these buildings serve as markers, as reminders, and keepers of the impact of a way of life. If we only preserve the residences and buildings of the wealthy of a city, those are the only place memories we maintain. I use Hayden many times in the book, as I argue, actually, that several of these texts are trying to serve as place memories themselves. New storehouses for neighborhoods that have been destroyed, right? Trying to get the barrio on paper so you don't lose it, because it's going to be mowed over, right? It is under erasure, it is under threat. I think of Hayden in my current hometown. I live in Duxbury, Massachusetts. It was founded in 1637 as part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Maybe you've heard of that? It has all these fancy preserved historical buildings. It's like the Bradford House and the King Caesar House. And there's this whole lane, there's a plaque dedicated to shipbuilding. There was a very lucrative shipbuilding district. You can't go a quarter mile without stumbling into a cranberry bog where I live. They are everywhere, but nowhere is there a history of who worked those bogs. Where did they live? What were their lives like? These are seasonal workers from Cape Verde and Norway, of all places. These two groups were working together. These are historically the groups that worked those bogs. And we just don't record it. Duxbury just doesn't want to tell that story. And we don't have those sites of place memory to access those experiences.
Do you have any places in your hometown that are particularly special to you? Have they changed over time? Is the economic or social history of your town apparent in the landscape? Are there preserved buildings? Wanna give an example? Yeah.
Well, the lake is very important, you know.
Yeah. They preserved it.
Well, yeah.
It's still there, I saw it.
It's very, cannot be ignored, it's beautiful to walk by it. There are no, in the past, Chrysler had buildings right on the lake.
Huh?
All of that is gone. Waukegan still has buildings that are facing the lake. But then the other thing is we have a lot of buildings from the 1930s, like Southport. What's the other one? I can't think of the name. There are a lot of beautiful buildings that were built during that time period, and they're still being used. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. Rick?
I have to say that I grew up in Duxbury.
What?
And I was just there like 2 weeks ago for
What?
my dad's birthday, yeah.
Do you know where the bog workers lived?
I don't, well, I mean, I know my mom would teach, she taught Plymouth history and would taught about
Yeah.
very many people there and so on, but
Yeah.
we were just talking about, the Twitchells used to live in this tiny, tiny house across from my parents' tiny house, which
Yeah.
is now a house like 10 times the size
Yeah.
of it. And all,
It's very fancy.
so many of my friends' houses growing up are now, were torn down and then giant, like McMansions
Yeah,
were built.
yeah.
So in addition to that kind of preservation.
Yeah. There used to be, Duxbury used to have a working class. It's gone. Yeah.
Like my parents were teachers and teachers now couldn't.
Could not afford to live there, yeah. And those buildings
Outside.
are also gone. So it's like they were never there. Yeah, that's very funny.
Yeah.
Application! I'm going over a little bit, so we'll just spend a little time on this. This is about literature. I hope it allows you to think about your spaces, but I also hope you can use it in applying it to things. So I want to look at a poem together. This is Freeway 280 by Lorna D. Cervantes, just for a little bit, just at the end here. And maybe you can tell me what you see, which of these theories you feel like are at work. Shannon, do you want to read?
Oh.
I just imagine you're like a very good reader.
It would be my great pleasure to read, if you'd like me to.
Yes.
Okay. Freeway 280. Las casitas near the gray cannery, nestled amid wild abrazos of climbing roses and man-high red geraniums, are gone now. The freeway conceals it all beneath a raised scar. But under the fake wind sounds of the open lanes and the abandoned lots below, new grasses sprout. Wild mustard remembers. Old gardens come back stronger than they were. Trees have been left standing in their yards. Albaricoqueros, cerezos, nogales. Viejitas come here with paper bags to gather greens. Espinaca, verdolagas, hierba buena. I scramble over the wire fence that would have kept me out. Once I wanted the rigid lanes to take me to a place without sun, without the smell of tomatoes burning on swing shift in the greasy summer air. Maybe it's here, en los campos extraños de esta ciudad, where I'll find it, that part of me mown under like a corpse or a loose seed.
I have a lot of very specific questions that are here, but I would love to just hear, anything that struck you, anything about how how Cervantes is describing space here, or place that resonates. Yes, Amanda?
Yes. It made me think of Mike Davis, the urban historian, and how the freeway is concealing everything beneath it, and it's just been maybe not Mike Davis. I think I was thinking of I was thinking of the stratification and stuff and building through it, but I do think like they chose to put the freeway there for a reason, and that reason is that it wasn't fancy and, white and economic and stuff. So it's just seeing that part of history has been erased.
Yeah. You actually picked up on something that I didn't mention. Davis, Davis is a Marxist too, so it makes sense that you kind of put them both together. Excellent. Yeah, you've got the sort of the freeway running over this, and this is now a vacant lot. There's a new mode of production in town. There's this live space versus the conceived space, right? The live space of the viejitas, the old ladies. They know what they can get there. The old gardens are still there. Notice what she does in the opening. Las casitas near the Great Cannery, nestled amid wild abrazos of climbing roses and man-high red geraniums. Can you picture that? She gives it to you. It's like it's in front of her eyes. And then under the enjambment, she says, are gone now. They're not in front of her eyes. It's not there anymore. But she just gave it to you in poetry because she has that place memory is so strong for her. She can describe it with her eyes closed. She can describe it even though it's gone. And now all that's left from the outside, what you would see would be a raised scar. If you weren't from there, you wouldn't even know to look. What about transnationalism? See anything transnational about you're nodding? What do you? Just how the gardens are like fighting back against all of this like industrialization that's happening above it. It's like the community and the literal space that the community once was is still there and fighting against the freeway system that has taken over. Yeah, and how does Cervantes tell you that it's the community fighting back? How does she kind of signal to you that there was a community there? What do you think? Yeah.
Well, the old gardens come back stronger than they were.
Yeah.
And then the other part of transnationalism is the language. It makes
Right.
it so rich to have those Spanish words mixed in with all the English.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and it's not random when she brings the Spanish in, right? I think Claire just whispered it into your ears. It's the Spanish. Yes, I know. It's the Spanish. Right? That's telling us that that's the community that was there before. This is a Chicanx. This is a Mexican American community, and she's using the words that they used to refer to these things, right? They know what greens to gather in this space. And she gives you the names of them, right? She knows too. Yeah.
I also see it in scrambling over the wire fence to get back in, even though she wanted to be out first.
Yeah.
It's like that not really feeling a part of the one culture or the other culture. So like that push and pull, trying to feel at home.
Yeah, exactly. Once I wanted to get out, all the opportunities are elsewhere. All the opportunities are on that freeway. But I'm not fully of that. I'm not fully of there. I'm not from there. Maybe I can learn something from this place that I'm from. Yeah.
In that same line too, it's not only the physical and metaphysical going over the border, but the fact that scrambling over the wire fence, meaning that the author lives in the newer, they aren't living in where all these things used to be. They're living in another area.
Yeah, right. This area is no longer available for them to live. Also, it's a possibility, right? The economy we see a little bit, right? The greasy summer air, the smell of tomatoes burning on swing shift. This cannery town. So there's a factory that brought, we can imagine, all these workers to this space, and is now kind of under change or construction. Maybe it's here in Los Campos Extraños de esta ciudad, so the strange fields of this city, where I'll find it, that part of me, mown under, like a corpse or a loose seed. Micah, you want to mess with that?
Yeah, and kind of like it was the seed that struck out to me in that.
Yeah.
Because it's one of those things like she's trying to there is that push and pull. Like she did think it was like out there, like, no, it's not, but, no, it's like, that part is still buried. Like, it's still there, and it's still kind of able to grow.
Yeah, it's buried in the ground, right? And the conceived idea of that space is that there's nothing there but corpses, right? It's dead. There's nothing to learn from this space. She's like, or a loose seed, something that you plant in the ground, and you get something beautiful that comes out of it, right? That maybe this is the anchor. More to say, but I've kept you too long. But I hope that, as one of my students said, I have ruined space for you. Yeah, that's a good compliment. Yeah, so thank you so much for telling me things about your towns and about this space. And I look forward to talking some more with you after.
Give it up for Christine.